So today we are going to be discussing Mr. Elliot. That's correct, the bad guy from Persuasion. This poor guy has had his evil motives totally misrepresented in so many Persuasion adaptations. But today, that will no longer be a problem because he's getting his moment in the sun. We're going to be talking about his true motives, his nefarious plots, and we're going to be answering some of the questions about him that you submitted to me on Instagram. So if you would like to learn all about that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. And I think to truly understand who Mr. Elliot is, we need to understand more about the Elliot family in general. With this question from Instagram, how many Elliots are there and why are they romantic love interests to each other? That is a great question. The answer is there are 5 main Elliots that are active in the book. There is, of course, the main character of the book, who is Anne Elliot, and her father, who is Sir Walter Elliot, baronet. Now, she has 2 sisters, an older sister, Elizabeth, or Miss Elliot, who's kind of vain and full of herself, and then her younger sister, Mary, who is a hypochondriac. Now, Mary married into the Musgrove family, so through most of the story, she's Mary Musgrove now. And she has 2 sons. And of course, at this point, Anne's mother has passed away. Now, if you look at Anne's immediate family, a major problem immediately shows up, and that is the fact that she has no brothers, which means that her father has no son and heir to inherit the estate and to inherit the baronetcy. But in true Austen fashion, this family has a cousin who can inherit, and that cousin is Mr. Elliot. Now, Mr. William Walter Elliot is that cousin, similar to Mr. Collins, that can come in, and because he descends from the male line, and he descends from the original baronet in the family, he can inherit both the estate that's under entail and the baronetcy. Now, if you would like to learn more all about what a baronet is, what entails are, what's with all this inheritance stuff, I have so many videos on that topic I'll be linking to below. And similar to Mr. Collins, Mr. Elliot is not the girl's first cousin. He's more likely at least their second cousin, or even possibly further removed to them than that. Now, there's actually an important difference between him and Mr. Collins, though, and that is Mr. Elliot is very charming and agreeable. In fact, the book describes him this way. He was a man of exceedingly good manners. He seemed about 30, and though not handsome, had an agreeable person. Mr. Elliot is charming and intelligent, and depending on who you are, some people think he's handsome, other people don't. But basically, he was the type of cousin back in the day that a girl wouldn't necessarily mind marrying. Which takes us to the second part of that question you guys submitted earlier, which is, why are they romantic love interests to each other? And the answer is for the same reason that Mr. Collins is a potential love interest in the story. He's the cousin set to inherit everything. Though there is a very big important difference between why the Bennet girls would want to marry Mr. Collins and why the Elliot girls would want to marry Mr. Elliot, and that is money. So the Elliot girls want to keep the home and they want to keep that title around, while the Bennet girls, while they would like to keep the home and the estate around in their family, they also are poor. As I've talked about in the video, is the Bennet family poor? The girls individually in the Bennet families have very small dowries, they have very small fortunes, and that does 2 things. 1, it makes it very hard for them to attract a husband, and 2, when their father dies, it's going to leave them with very, very little to live on. They're going to be poor once their dad dies. So Mr. Collins offers them that money incentive to want to marry him too. He's going to inherit the family money that they desperately need. However, the Elliot girls, while obviously having more money would have probably been nice for them too, so basically they don't have that added incentive of, oh, we're going to be poor if we don't marry Mr. Elliot. What they're really looking to do is keep that social status in the family and keep the things they love, like their home, in the family. And that is exactly how Elizabeth, Anne Elliot's older sister, felt about him. She wanted to marry this guy when they were younger. It says, Elizabeth had, while a very young girl, as soon as she had known him to be, in the event of her having no brother, the future baronet, meant to marry him, and her father had always meant that she should. She really wanted to keep that baronet status in her immediate family in some way through marriage. And in fact, we see that later in the book when Anne is kind of considering, like, what would it be like to marry Mr. Elliot? And this is what it has to say. The idea of becoming what her mother had been, of having the precious name of Lady Elliot first revived in herself, of being restored to Kellynch, calling it her home again, her home forever, was a charm which she could not immediately resist. Right? So even Anne Elliot is thinking, yeah, if I marry him, I'll get to be Lady Elliot, that title. I'm going to be able to go back home to the place that I love, and that house is going to be in my family. And that is exactly why young Elizabeth wants to marry the future baronet. And she meets him and he's agreeable and she's like, yeah, we're on. And then he ghosts her. Why? Because Mr. Elliot only loves money and Elizabeth is not rich enough to tempt him. Instead, he goes and marries a low-class heiress. It's very shocking Regency-wise. Now let's get into Mr. Elliot's first evil plot of the book, marrying for money. So young Mr. Elliot was a law student, and he was definitely of the upper class. He has the family background. He's the great-grandson of a baronet. He's educated. He's mannered. He is of the upper class, but the thing he's lacking is money. The book describes him as quite poor during this period of life, and even though he knows that eventually there's a really good chance he's going to inherit the Kellynch estate and the baronetcy, and he's just not going to wait around being poor because this guy has not died yet. He needs money now. As we've talked about in past videos, one of the main ways young men of the upper class would get money is through marriage. They would try to marry rich heiresses. And the book tells us at that period of his life, he had one object in view, to make his fortune, and by a rather quicker process than the law. He was determined to make it by marriage. Now, how determined was he to marry rich? Well, he was willing to go so far as to break social class boundaries. In fact, the book consistently describes his wife of being of low birth, of being low born, of being a very low woman. Basically, she was from the lower class. We hear of her family background. Her father was a grazier. Her grandfather had been a butcher. Now, if you've seen my videos on how to be a gentleman or lady in Jane Austen's time, or are Lizzie and Darcy of the same social class, or how to marry up and social climb, then you know how big of a deal social class was and the major boundaries it put up between people being able to marry. And yet Mr. Elliot was willing to ignore all of that because somehow this very low-class girl had ended up an heiress. And I think it's fascinating the book never really tells us exactly how that happened to her. It does say that her cousins introduced her into society, but it doesn't say that the cousins gave her the money. It doesn't say that someone went into trade. It doesn't explain how this girl got so rich. All we know is she's a very low class, plus lots of money, and Mr. Elliot married her. Now, if you have seen my video on marrying up and social climbing, then you know that a marriage like this, according to Regency society, was doomed to unhappiness, right? It's like, you cannot marry across social class lines and expect to be happy. And that is, of course, what happens in Mr. Elliot's first marriage. They end up very unhappy. In fact, it says, they were wretched together, but she was too ignorant and giddy for respect, and he had never loved her. So this poor girl is living out the Regency expectation of what would happen. And so here we do see, like I've talked about before, Jane Austen upholding those social class barriers in her book. Now, of course, someone may look at, for example, how Anne goes and visits her sickly and poor friend Mrs. Smith and say like, oh, but look, Anne's more enlightened than that, right? She doesn't care about social class. But as we've talked about in past videos, her friend Mrs. Smith is still of the upper class. Here's a girl who had an upper class education, lived a very fashionable life in London. She is just now fallen on hard times. But Anne Elliot is still treating her as she is of the upper class because, well, she is. Now, what makes Anne Elliot different from her family is she's not a snob within their own social sphere. Meanwhile, her family is a snob even within their own social sphere. I mean, her dad and sister look down on the family that the youngest daughter, Mary, married into, the Musgrove family. They're landed, they're rich, but they do not have a baronetcy, so they're not as cool as them. And so I think that is the difference between Anne and her family. She's not a snob within the same social sphere where her family is. However, she still is upholding those social sphere lines. Which also takes us to this question one of you guys asked, which is, are Anne and Captain Wentworth the same class? And I would say that there is a very, very high chance that they are. Captain Wentworth either has to come from the upper class or the extreme top level of the middle class. But back to Mr. Elliot, he marries this low-class girl and scandalizes everybody. Now, something I think very funny about how this was handled in the Persuasion Netflix adaptation is that instead of making her low class, they made her American. In the movie, it says, like, he married an American. And I'm like, is this the modern translation of low class? American? Oh. I kind of wonder if they were just trying to avoid dealing with class issues, or they really did think like nobody would get that if we said her grandfather was a butcher, so let's just make her American, because everyone knows that's embarrassing to marry an American. Anyway, this low class / apparently American girl dies after a very unhappy marriage, and Mr. Elliot is now free and rich, because even though his wife died, he still gets to keep all the money, and he's wealthy. Or is he? So the 1990s Persuasion tells us that at this point, Mr. Elliot exceeds his income, loses all his money, and is heavily in debt by the time he's hitting on Anne Elliot. Now, is that true? Is this the real Mr. Elliot story? The answer is no. That is the opposite of the truth. Mr. Elliot is a very cautious person and takes good care of his money. He is still very wealthy. In fact, the book describes him as having long had as much money as he could spend. He had nothing to wish for on the side of avarice or indulgence. So if Mr. Elliot is still really wealthy, why would 1995 Persuasion say that he was poor and that he lost it all? The answer is, I think they were trying to simplify his motives for us for his second evil plot of the book, which is spying on his uncle and marrying Anne. Which you guys have been asking me, why does Mr. Elliot want to marry Anne? And to get to the bottom of that, we need to go back to when Anne was at Lyme. So she's at Lyme with her friends, she's down on the beach, she starts heading back to town, and they pass a stranger. And this is what it has to say. They ascended and passed him, and as they passed, Anne's face caught his eye, and he looked at her with a degree of earnest admiration, which she could not be insensible of. In fact, it's so obvious that this guy is into Anne that Captain Wentworth sees it, and it sparks his jealousy. Anne happens to bump into this guy again later, and again, the second meeting, short as it was, also proved again by the gentleman's looks that he thought hers very lovely. So who is this guy who thinks Anne is so lovely? Well, it's Mr. Elliot. So right there, before Anne knows who he is or he knows who Anne is, he's already into her. He's physically attracted to Anne. However, that is as far as it goes at Lyme, because he goes off in his carriage and eventually he ends up in Bath. Now, what does Mr. Elliot find in Bath? Rumors and gossip. Sir Walter and Mrs. Clay, his daughter's friend who's staying there in Bath with him, are getting far too close for anybody's comfort. And Mr. Elliot is not going to have it, because if Sir Walter marries Mrs. Clay and they have a son, that son's going to inherit the baronetcy and not Mr. Elliot. And as the book tells us, Mr. Elliot cannot bear the idea of not being Sir William. He has to be Sir William. Thereby, he needs to break up Sir Walter and Mrs. Clay. But how will he do this? Because ever since he totally spurned Elizabeth back in the day when they were younger, him and his cousins have not been on talking terms. Well, that's not a problem for a charming man like Mr. Elliot. He's going to worm his way back into the family. This is his plan. He's going to recover such a footing in the family as might give him the means of ascertaining the degree of his danger and of circumventing the lady in which he found it material. Basically, he's going to start hanging out at Sir Walter's house all the time, keeping an eye on things, and break them up. However, with him constantly over at the Elliots' house, people start thinking that he's interested in Elizabeth. After all, everybody thinks Elizabeth is gorgeous, including Elizabeth herself. And yet he doesn't make any major moves on Elizabeth. He could have probably won over Elizabeth, proposed to her, and been planning their wedding before Anne even showed up to Bath. And yet he doesn't, even though that seems like it could have helped his evil plot of spying on his uncle, right? The book even tells us that if he had married one of Sir Walter's daughters, that could be his best hope of keeping Sir Walter single, by the watchfulness which a son-in-law's rights would have given. But yet, Mr. Elliot does not do that. This is one of your guys' most asked questions on this topic. Why he won't marry Elizabeth? Why is he so focused on marrying Anne? Does Anne have some special power that Elizabeth doesn't? What's going on? And here, my friends, is the answer to this question. He doesn't marry Elizabeth because he doesn't like her. Mr. Elliot was not willing just to marry someone in order to get these son-in-law spying privileges. Rather, he wanted to marry Anne because he genuinely liked her. That ability to spy on her father was like a massive added bonus. However, it was not his main motivation. Mr. Elliot's motives when he was first befriending Sir Walter and trying to break him and Mrs. Clay up were just that. They did not have that marriage component in them. However, after Anne shows up, and she is that beautiful girl that he could not keep his eyes off of in Lyme, he's like, I think my motives for calling here now have two purposes: hitting on Anne and spying on Sir Walter. We see this described in the book. Anne's friend Mrs. Smith says to her, "He saw you then at Lyme and liked you so well as to be exceedingly pleased to meet you again in Camden Place as Miss Anne Elliot, and from that moment, I have no doubt, had a double motive in his visits there." So really that double motive of marriage and wanting to marry Anne or wanting to marry anybody did not show up until he was like, oh, that hot girl from Lyme's here. I need to get on this. The interesting thing about Mr. Elliot's feelings for Anne is, yes, obviously there's that physical component, there's that I can spy on her dad component, but there's also the big component of he genuinely appreciates her fine qualities. He describes Anne as one who is too modest for the world in general to be aware of half her accomplishments, and too highly accomplished for modesty to be natural in any other woman. He sees Anne, he sees that no one else sees Anne, but he truly appreciates these qualities. Now, what I think is super fascinating about this is that Jane Austen's bad guys often have this ability. They can see the excellent sterling qualities of her heroines and they appreciate them, they love them, they want that in their life. However, that still does not make them any better men. This is the same exact thing we see with Mr. Crawford and Fanny in Mansfield Park. He sees Fanny's value, he just can't stay true to her. Likewise, Willoughby in Sense and Sensibility is totally a scoundrel, but he's also genuinely enamored with Mary Ann and her amazing qualities. However, sadly, as much as these men may see and appreciate the value of these women, it does not make them better men, as we see in all of these stories. If we go back to this question of why Mr. Elliot wants to marry Anne, he's genuinely attracted to her. He appreciates her qualities. He sees her value. He's falling in love with Anne. And of course, there's that big added bonus of being able to spy on her dad, but that's not his main motive. And again, it's highlighted that that's not his main motive because Anne does not accept Mr. Elliot. She stays true to Captain Wentworth. She gets engaged to Captain Wentworth. And the way Mr. Elliot reacts is interesting because at that point he could have just switched to now hitting on Elizabeth and attempting to marry her to get those son-in-law privileges, but he doesn't. Instead, he employs a different tactic, which is separating Sir Walter and Mrs. Clay by having Mrs. Clay run off and become his mistress in London. In fact, the book says, "He soon quitted Bath, and on Mrs. Clay's quitting it soon afterwards and being next heard of as established under his protection in London, it was evident how double a game he had been playing and how determined he was to save himself from being cut out by one artful woman at least. Mr. Elliot had been playing a double game. Yes, he was genuinely valuing and wanting to marry Anne. However, he still had his eye on this whole Mrs. Clay and Sir Walter situation, and behind the scenes, he was setting up Mrs. Clay to develop affection for him and want to run off to be his mistress in London. However, is it like Persuasion Netflix adaptation would have us believe, and Mr. Elliot is just like crazy in love with Mrs. Clay and wants to run off and marry her? No, that is definitely not what's happening here. He really wanted to marry Anne, and this is the best he could do to protect the title after Anne goes and marries Captain Wentworth. However, that might be Mr. Elliot's plan, but could a wrench be thrown in this plan? Could something unforeseen happen to him? Well, this is the last we hear of Mrs. Clay and Mr. Elliot in Persuasion. It says, "It is now a doubtful point whether his cunning or hers may finally carry the day. Whether after preventing her from being the wife of Sir Walter, he may not be wheedled and caressed at last into making her the wife of Sir William." So if he's not careful, Mrs. Clay, with all her cunning and flattery skills, might just get him to marry her in the end. Ah, the irony. Anyway, just to sum all of this up, who is Mr. Elliot? Well, he's Anne Elliot's cousin who's set to inherit her father's estate and baronetcy. He is money-loving and title-loving and generally not a good guy. We didn't even get into his whole thing he had going down with her friend Mrs. Smith and all that drama, but also not a good guy there. But at the same time, he wanted to marry Anne because he genuinely liked her. Was he also just planning on having Mrs. Clay be his mistress on the side? Yeah, but that's just because he's kind of a scoundrel. So let me know in the comments down below. Do you think if something had taken Captain Wentworth out of commission, like him marrying someone else or him going back out to sea, and if Anne had never heard about Mr. Elliot's true character from her friend Mrs. Smith, do you think that ultimately Anne would have ended up marrying Mr. Elliot? Do you think she would have been persuaded to believe herself in love, and the idea of being Lady Elliot would have just been too overwhelming for her? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, keep being awesome because you're awesome. Bye!
Give me love, give me all your love, oh, 'cause I want you. No one else makes me feel this way, don't know what you do.